It's my distinct privilege to welcome Senator Marco Rubio, who joins us from his home state of Florida, to ISI's Future of American Political Economy Conference. Senator Rubio has been one of the more enterprising politicians tackling issues relating to political economy. He serves on the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, the Senate Appropriations Committee, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's also the vice chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So you see a nice intersection of things relating to politics, economics, and national security. He has been a champion of what he's called common good capitalism, which directly relates to the topic of this conference. And on the issue of China and manufacturing and national security, he's really been leading the way in terms of coming up with a strategy to counter China's 2025 plan. So welcome, Senator Rubio.
Thank you, guys. I'm sorry. I guess I'm supposed to be on this an hour ago, so I'll just say I thought it was on Central Time. So
Okay.
how's that as an excuse?
We forgive you. So to just kick things off, let's start with the big picture. You've called for Republicans to abandon what you've described as, quote, free market fundamentalism and return to a common good capitalism that prioritizes the American worker and the American family while still upholding long-time conservative principles like individual liberty and defense of traditional values. Can you explain a little more? What do you mean by free market fundamentalism, and what does a common good capitalism agenda and platform look like in practice?
So fundamentalism basically means so let me just start it this way. I believe in the free market. I believe in capitalism. I have 90 miles from the southernmost tip of my home state of Florida. There is a disaster called Cuba, which is all because socialism doesn't work and communism is a disaster. But we also have to ask ourselves, okay, so we have a capitalist economy. What does it exist for? What is its purpose? Is the purpose for us to serve the capitalist economy, or is the purpose for the capitalist economy to serve us? And so my view of it is that capitalism and free market free enterprise is a tool. It is a tool for economic growth, for development, for job creation, for wealth creation, for opportunity creation. It is the greatest poverty eradicator in all of human history. And we should always embrace free enterprise because it is a tool that serves us. It serves our country. It serves our people. It serves our society. And when it is working the way it's supposed to work, and it is creating good paying jobs for Americans, and it's strengthening our industrial base, and it's also protecting our national security in the process of doing all that, it's phenomenal. But what do we do in those instances in which the free enterprise or free market outcome is bad for America? For example, the free market says it is cheaper. It is cheaper to buy pharmaceuticals. 80%, 81% of our active ingredients are in our pharmaceuticals. It is cheaper to make them, and it is cheaper to buy them in China. That's the pure free market outcome. But it is not good for the United States to rely on China for 81 or 82% of our basic ingredients in most of our generic pharmaceuticals. So you have a conflict. And my argument is that in those instances in which the free enterprise outcome reaches a conclusion that it's actually bad for our country or bad for our people, that's where we have to decide, well, are we living in the world of theory, or do we have a practical reality that we have to confront in that case? And that's what I mean by abandoning the fundamentalism. We can't allow the fundamentalism to lead us to forget the purpose of all this, which is to lead to outcomes that are good for Americans and good for our country. So in that particular case, there is no free enterprise outcome. The free market can't deal with the fact that China is cheating and stealing and undermining competition. And frankly, it also can't solve the problem that it will always be cheaper to do it there than here because their government subsidizes it. And so in those instances, there's something we're going to have to do about it, which in order to address it, or we've created an enormous vulnerability for the country. So that's sort of a graphic example of what I mean by that.
Hey listeners, thanks for joining us on Conservative Conversations. I'm happy to announce a special opportunity for Conservative Conversations listeners. we are offering the chance to win 2 free tickets to our upcoming gala for Western Civilization. Featured at this gala will be Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, Daniel Mahoney, fellow at the Real Clear Foundation and senior writer at Law and Liberty, and philanthropist Diana Davis Spencer. The gala will take place on September 16th at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. To sign up to win, go to isi.org/podcast/GWC. That's isi.org/podcast/GWC. I hope to see you there. Now let's get back to the show.
I'm curious. I think on the national security related issues, it's pretty easy for conservatives to understand why it might make sense to put some limits, some guardrails up in terms of the free market. But I'm curious more broadly, what is the proper role of the federal government in our constitutional system in shaping the nation's political economy? And what would you describe as the guardrails? Because I know you're a critic of socialism. Yeah. Many on the left, the Biden administration, they also they also believe there are a number of things that need to be restructured, relimited, redone by the federal government when it comes to political economy. So how is your approach different? What are the guardrails for conservatives?
No, that's a great question. First of all, I think if anything that we have learned from this pandemic, we've learned 2 things from the pandemic. The first is always know what's behind you on a Zoom call. That's why I've got this chair here, so nobody can come behind you. And the second is that federalism works. That federalism is really important, and that's why here in my home state of Florida, I believe that our response, our hospitalization, death rates, infection rates are comparable to anything you've seen anywhere in the country. In many cases, better than New York. But we didn't suffer the catastrophic economic damage that was inflicted upon them by their corrupt and incompetent political leadership because of federalism. Because federalism allowed Florida to have a response that was different than New York. So I think by and large, that's an important reminder for us that the federal government's role really should be limited. And its primary objective is national security. And then the second objective that it has is obviously interstate commerce and things of that nature. But we should always understand that there is very little innovation that comes out of the federal government. And generally speaking, for the most part, given a country as large and diverse as this one, any one-size-fits-all approach to any concept or any issue or any challenge is probably not going to be a good one. Now, the guardrails are as follows. I think we have to understand that it is in our national interest, A, to have an industrial capacity. So as an example, we have to be able to make things. We have to be able to make heavy industry. We have to be able to make ships and airplanes. We have to be able to make these things, just be able to protect our country. Because I assure you that if we outsource all that to China and we end up in conflict with them, they're not going to be sending us ships and airplanes. But it extends to things like semiconductors and increasingly, precision medicine and all sorts of new innovations that are coming down there. And some of the older things too. I mean, we have to be able to make railways. We have to be able to make roads, all of these things. So that's the first. And the second is the country has a vested interest in ensuring that we have an economy that doesn't just produce jobs, but produces jobs that allow people to get married, start a family, own a home, be involved in their community, and retire with dignity. If you lose that kind, if your economy's not producing those kinds of jobs, you won't have families, you won't have strong families, therefore you won't have strong communities, and then there's no law or government program you can pass to substitute or replace for it. So I think we always have to look for not just national security issues, but do we have an economy that is producing jobs in industry, that is producing jobs in certain industries that produce that kind of work? Because if the family breaks down and the community breaks down, nothing else works. Nothing else works. You can pour $10 trillion into it like Joe Biden and the Democrats are trying, and it will never make up for broken down families and broken down and communities. You just can't. No country, that's what a country's made of. That's the fiber and the glue of a country.
Shifting gears a little bit, there's been a fundamental shift in the U.S. economy over the past 4 decades. You've argued that American economic growth is now more driven by short-term financial returns than by innovation and production. We know business investment in the U.S. has been decreasing, falling nearly a tenth of our GDP in the 1980s to less than half of that today. What does this fundamental shift in the U.S. economy from a pro-worker to pro-shareholder position mean for the future of our country, and how should it shape our policy today?
Yeah, and so let me say, first of all, many of our major multinational corporations do not consider themselves to be American. Their leaders consider themselves to be citizens of the world, and frankly, their shareholders are from all over the world. And they don't make any decisions on the basis of what's good for the country that actually made them possible, where they're headquartered, where their offices might be, but they don't act in our national interest, nor do they feel they have any sort of obligation to do so. We have to recognize that. I think the second thing that's shifted, frankly, is if you look at a major corporation, publicly traded or the like, and it has a real incentive, so do the people who run those companies, the CEO and so forth, to deliver on a quarterly basis returns, even if those returns on a quarterly basis in the short term are actually potentially corporate suicide in the long term. So as an example, the ability to expand into a market, you're going to go into China to do work. And I keep going back to China because frankly, it is by far it is the issue that the U.S.-China relationship will define the 21st century. So you're a company and you have a chance to go into China and get some market share. Not a lot, but maybe 5%, but that's a lot of money. And you're going to look really good. Your stock's going to climb and you're going to be rewarded for it. And so you do so. Never mind the fact that China forces you to partner with a Chinese firm who, as they're working with you, is learning how to do what you do and actually stealing it from you. And in 10 years, they'll be doing it. They won't need you anymore. They'll kick you out. You'll be out of business. That happens. That happens a lot. And so you see a lot of that sort of investment because you're being rewarded for the short-term return, as opposed to, okay, we've made some money this year. Why don't we invest it in inventing something new or some new capacity? And part of that is actually because of big government, right? In the past, what would happen is that creative destruction would take place. You had competitors in our field, and those competitors were able to, if you got stale and stagnant, the new competitor would come up with a new idea, and certainly we're out of business. I imagine most of the people perhaps watching this don't recall, but there was a time when you had to go into a video store and actually rent videos from a place called Blockbuster. And that's long gone. It's been long ago replaced by an innovator that sort of took their place. But imagine if the government had passed a law saying the only way you can watch videos is it has to be rented from a physical location, because we have to make sure that you're 17 years old to watch a rated R movie, and it's in the best interest of children to not be watching bad movies. We can't do that if it's streaming. It's got to be in a physical location where a human being can ID you. We'd still have Blockbuster Video, but we wouldn't have any of these streaming services that are out there. That exists in industry after industry. It exists now. And where you really see it pronounced in some ways is in social media, not because of the laws in that case, but because they now hold such a dominant, almost monopoly position. 5 or 6 companies in the tech sector hold such a monopoly position that is nearly impossible for an innovator to enter the space. And if it does, you might just get bought out, and it's tempting to walk away from it. Again, so those are examples of the fact that the short-termism is both driven by the structure of our regulations, which the harder those regulations are to navigate, the more overhead you have to carry in terms of administrative compliance and the like, and also driven, frankly, by the fact that capital markets now reward short-term return.
Sort of jumping off one of the things you said relating to China, we had a very lively panel on China this morning, and 2 questions that were really standing out to me. The first is a question about sort of the elite class in America, people in Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Street. One of the things that really concerns me about China is it seems to me like, most normal people they understand the economic threat that China poses to us. But it's a significant concern to me that most of the people at sort of the highest levels of power in American life have such a deep financial interest in penetrating the Chinese market that their business decisions might actually run counter to our national interests. So that's one concern. How do we tackle that? Because that's a really sticky issue. The second is if the idea of decoupling, at least in strategic industries from China, is something that's on the table. What do you do about, a lot of people have 401ks, retirements, a lot of their welfare towards the end of their life is going to be connected to a lot of these corporations that have heavy connections to China. And so if a serious decoupling effort were made, people would log into Fidelity and see their, portfolios crashing. So and I think there would be a very quick backlash to that. Also, people like having cheap iPhones, and they're used to that. So how do you respond to sort of this intersection of the financial incentives running one way and national interests running another?
Well, let me just touch on the last point briefly here and see if I can describe it for you. You're right. People do like to have like a consumer electronic that's affordable. What's interesting is what we've done is, in order for that consumer electronic to be affordable, we have to make it in another country. That means the job that you may used to have, the good paying job you once had making this is gone. So now what is happening is you now have to go work at a lower wage place, okay, in order to buy this cheaper good. And whatever difference there is between what you used to make and what you make now, yeah, you can afford this, but the government's got to figure out a way now to provide you an additional benefit to supplement what you no longer make because you're now making this somewhere else. So in essence, yes, the factory that once made these is now gone. And so you now have to work somewhere you don't get made as much. You can afford the phone, but the rest of your life now we have to subsidize it. We have to find some government program now to make up the difference. Medicaid, you name it. So it's either way you're paying for it. On the issue you talked about with the decoupling, first of all, some of that's already happened. No matter what, it's already going to start to happen for a couple of reasons. The first is both the pandemic and the Trump years has rattled a lot of the supply chains around the world, and people are starting to realize it's not smart to have all your eggs in one basket. And the beneficiaries are not going to necessarily be America, but it's Vietnam, Indonesia, and other places in Southeast Asia that I think can step up and begin to fill some of that role. So countries already have companies already have sort of a vested interest to, at a minimum, diversify supply chains in terms of production. In terms of market share, it's a very difficult thing, and you're absolutely right. And you see this for sports, especially, but also in entertainment. If you're an actor or an actress, you can't condemn China because if you do, no film that you're in will ever be shown there. And no Hollywood studio is going to produce a film and spend a lot of money on it if it can't be shown in China because it's the fastest growing, movie market on the planet. And so, as a great example, is Richard Gere used to get major motion pictures. Richard Gere will never again have a major motion picture because no movie with Richard Gere in it will ever be shown in China because of his position on Tibet. So let there be no doubt that is a real influence at the Hollywood level. And it's also an influence in sports. We saw what the NBA did. We saw what athletes have done. You have an athlete, you have a contract with whomever, and China's a big market. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars a year in endorsement deals tied directly to the Chinese market. So you can be rest assured that athletes are not going to be commenting about China because if they get boycotted, it costs them millions of dollars. And the Chinese know this. They absolutely play this game. They know how it works, and they use it against us. It's a big, big challenge. People have to be shamed into that reality, especially if they're willing to go all in on ripping apart and boycotting a U.S. state whose elected representatives have passed a law and are accountable to the people of that state on voting rights, whatever you name, or voting security, whatever you want. So they'll boycott a state because they passed a law on voting, but they say nothing about the fact that in China, unelected dictators basically take Uyghur Muslims, put them in work camps, forced abortions and forced sterilization on women, separate children from their parents and try to strip them of their religious, their cultural and ethnic identity. They won't say anything about that. But if you pass a law that requires voter ID, we're going to boycott your state and we're going to move the All-Star game to another city because of all that. So it's crazy time. And I think we need to point that out consistently.
In pointing that out, I mean, what do you recommend? I mean, carrots or sticks or some combination of the two. How do we resolve?
Yeah, look, I mean, in that way, social and cultural shame in that sense is important because ultimately what will happen is twofold. I mean, either these people will have to lean forward. We've seen it gravitate, for example, on the issue of Uyghur Muslims and Xinjiang region of China. Mm-hmm. About 9 months ago, when we filed that forced labor bill that basically said that any product produced in that region of China is presumed to be made by forced labor, there's a rebuttable presumption. You have to come forward and prove that it's not. When we filed that bill, we had multiple major corporations, Nike and Apple included, who were lobbying against the bill to defeat it. And we pointed it out. People heard about it. They started talking about it, and they backed off. And we just passed the bill in the Senate and hopefully soon out of the House. So it does work. No, folks don't want to be caught doing it. They know it looks bad. They know it's wrong. But it's easy to do when no one's pointing out that hypocrisy. Once you start pointing out the hypocrisy, it does begin to shape behavior. But this is not just about, owning the libs kind of thing or involving or embarrassing people. This is a tool that China uses against us. I mean, they are using this against us. If you think about, you can't produce a movie that offends China, they basically are censoring our movies. You can't make a movie with a Chinese bad guy in it anymore because they won't play it in China. They basically have censorship rights over entertainment. There's no First Amendment respect in any way. I mean, they now can control the narrative in our country. So this is very dangerous. Beyond just annoying, there's a real challenge here that goes much deeper, and people have to wake up to it.
Before we move on with our interview, I wanted to give you a brief message from a friend of ISI. the Acton Institute. What good is freedom without virtue? Join economists, religious leaders, writers, newsmakers, and thinkers every Wednesday for conversations that bridge the gap between good intentions and sound economics on Acton Line, the flagship podcast from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. By demonstrating the compatibility of faith, liberty, and free markets, conversations on Acton Line reveal how economic freedom is essential to creating an environment in which religious freedom can flourish and that the market can function only when people behave morally. Faith and freedom must go hand in hand. To subscribe to Acton Line, visit acton.org/ISI or search Acton Line on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are available. That's acton.org/ISI to subscribe. Now, let's get back to our interview.
And so in the spirit of doing something about China, the Senate just passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Bill, the so-called China Bill. You were a vocal opponent of the piece of legislation and have criticized it for not being the China bill that America needs. Can you explain how the bill falls short and how we should be protecting capital markets and taxpayer investments from the threat posed by China?
Yeah. So my biggest point is this, and that is that if we're going to have 21st century industrial policy, which basically means, okay, America needs to be able to have a semiconductor foundry in our country. We have to be able to make these things because we rely on Taiwan, and Taiwan ever falls into the hands of the Chinese, we're in a lot of trouble on semiconductors, and that's essential for all sorts of industries. So we have to be able to do it. So the government's going to step forward and provide research and funding and funding for basic research that not only allows us to do that, and by the way, understand this, the reason why we have to is because you can't, for example, rare earth minerals, we can't compete with China in rare earth minerals because they will undercut our price. No matter what you do, no matter what price we come at, they'll undercut the price, or subsidize it so that no American company can succeed, and they can own the market share of it. So we have to address those sorts of things. Fine, but it's the way they wanted to do it. We know we have a serious problem at our universities. We have universities, they have researchers. There's first of all there are graduate students that are stealing this information, but then we also have American professors and American researchers who are openly sharing it with China. They're either selling it to them through secret deals, or the universities have financial interests in their partnership with China. So when you say that we're going to put all of your taxpayer money to fund basic research, but we're going to fund it through the system that they're stealing from us now you better put in some additional security measures. So I wanted additional security measures to ensure that we're not putting billions of dollars into basic research and the Chinese just steal it from us. And their universities went nuts and they started objecting. Oh, it's going to slow down the research. It's going to hamper the research. Well, you know what really slows down and hampers the research? Paying for it and then just having it immediately stolen and transferred to China. That's a crazy idea. And they wouldn't budge on it. So I voted against the bill. And I think if we can fix that, there's a lot to work on together. But we're not going to spend billions of dollars through the same process that the Chinese are already exploiting.
So what are some ways that we could put pressure, ISI focuses a lot on college campuses, that we could put pressure on the universities in regards to the relationship with China that they have?
Well, I think it's important for universities to disclose if they have financial relationships with China. China doesn't necessarily mean the Communist Party. It could be any of a series of soft power institutes that come onto American campuses and try to conduct activities. We have, for example, the Confucius Institutes across the country. We used to have them in Florida. They're all closed here now. And those come across as, we just want to, do interchange and teach people how to speak Mandarin and so forth. But in reality, what they're trying to do, and it's hard for us to fathom because we think in terms of 6 months and a year, they have 10 and 20-year plans. And I'm telling you, what they are saying is we go on a university campus. That is where we are going to identify the future members of Congress, the future CEOs, the future journalists, the future presidents of universities and the like. And we're going to start engaging with them now so that they come of age with a pro-China viewpoint on policy issues. And that'll bear fruit in 20, 30 years down the road. So those kinds of relationships, first of all, need to be disclosed and they need to be aware of. Second of all, in terms of research and so forth, I think that before you get government grants, particularly in those fields that China likes to steal, universities should be forced by law to disclose those grants to disclose those relationships. We need to know if you've got a senior researcher on your staff that's also under contract with some entity in China, because that's tremendous leverage. And frankly, it could very well be the way they're stealing it by whether they're wittingly or unwittingly being hacked into so that this information is transferred. And then I think the third is freedom of speech on campus. One of the conditions, one of the things we've seen in some campuses across America is a real restriction on academic freedom, the inability to hold, for example, a discussion panel on Uyghur Muslims, on Tibet, on Falun Gong, or any of these other issues, because your China relationship, whatever it is that you've got with them, your campus over there or whatever, is being threatened. In essence, the message has been sent to you that if you start holding these seminars on your campus, that may endanger a relationship with us that might be worth a lot of money for that university. So these are things that need to be disclosed and people need to be aware of. And in the case of the infringement on free speech, should not be allowed.
I want to shift gears. I have one more question for you, and then we'll move to several audience questions on family policy, something we've been talking a lot about. A key part of the idea of a humane economy is that it ought to strengthen the most important institution in our society, the family. President Biden and his colleagues on the left have paid much lip service to their child allowance program that just went into effect this past month. What elements do you see making up a pro-family, pro-children policy agenda? And how can conservatives promote families without falling prey to the invasive and fiscally irresponsible tactics that the left likes to use?
Well, let me begin by saying you need to have an economy that sustains family life. You need to have an economy that allows people to get married and start a family, own a home in a safe neighborhood, provide their children opportunities, and retire with dignity. So you have to have an economy that's producing that kind of work that allows you to do that. So that's the first thing. And that's why economic policy is so important. I started out our conversation highlighting the need not just to have an economy that's creating jobs, but creating those kinds of jobs, those kinds of durable, meaningful, dignified jobs that allow that to happen. The second is school choice. I believe the ultimate arbiter of where a child goes to school and what they are learning should be in the hands of the parents. We had a very interesting situation here in Florida a couple of weeks ago where one of our local school boards just had an election. We got a bunch of radicals from the left elected to the school board, and they decided they were not going to renew any of the contracts of any of the charter schools in that county. Of course, that led to an all-out rebellion, went to the State Board of Education, and ultimately was resolved in a positive way. But the point is that in that debate, you heard many of the people talking about people on the school board, our children, our students. They're not their children. They're not their students. Those children belong to their parents. The parents are the ones that are responsible for raising them, and ultimately only have a handful of years to do that. And they should be empowered to put their children in the educational setting that they choose. And it shouldn't be, and it isn't fair that the only Americans who don't have school choice are poor and working Americans. Because if you're wealthy, you're going to move, or you're going to put your kids in a school that you like because you can afford it. If you're upper middle class, maybe you'll move to a better neighborhood with better schools. But if you're working class, you're poor, you're stuck going to whatever school the government tells you your kids have to go to. It doesn't matter how bad the school is. It doesn't matter how dangerous the school might be. You have very few options in many parts of this country. So school choice is a key element of it. And I would say on tax policy, you talked about that. There's a difference between a child tax credit and what we have now. They call it a child tax credit, but that's not what it is. They're basically sending $300 a month per child, $400 under the age of 6 for the next 6 months. It's a check in the mail whether or not you're working. And it's calculated on the basis of either if you filed taxes in the past, what your child tax credit looked like back then. But it's not linked to work in any way. What Mike Lee and I have worked on is a real expansion of the child tax credit that basically says even if you don't have, and we actually achieved part of it in 2017, if you're a working parent and your primary or entire tax liability is contained within FICA, the payroll tax, you can apply a significant percentage of the child tax credit towards FICA. Because if it's just towards income tax, there's a lot of people making under $36,000 a year that don't pay federal income tax, but they are paying payroll tax. And all that means is parents get to keep more of the money that they're earning, but it's pro-work. And that's important. You can't be pro-family if you're not pro-work. And so none of our policies should disincentivize family formation, but they should also not disincentivize work. And not because people are lazy, but because people respond to incentives. And that's important in our tax policy. And that's why the child tax credit needs to be brought back to what it really should be, which is a tax credit applied against a tax liability because of a paycheck produced by work.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to our 3 audience questions, and we're taking these through the ISI app. Looks like people want to get back to the China question. So there's a question from Tom. How does our national debt play into concerns with the relationship to China and the global economy, and specifically with respect to concerns of national security?
Well, it plays in a number of ways. The first is that it's now obviously been accelerated by the pandemic, and everyone's taken on weight. China has debt, by the way, too. It's not often talked about, it's not nearly as transparent, but they too have sovereign debt that they've had to finance things through. But where it really becomes a problem down the road is, at some point, if the yield on this debt reaches such as kind of a normal return. Right now, despite all the problems we have, we're still the safest bet in the world. I mean, honestly, what other country in the world, if you had to bet your money somewhere, who would you bet it on? And that America's going to pay you what you lent them is a pretty good bet compared to anywhere else in the world that doesn't have our track record of stability. But at some point, the yield on the debt, meaning the interest you're paying on this money, is going to change. People are going to demand more. We'll lend you the same money, but we want more return on it. It's too low right now. We want more. And that point will come where we are actually spending more just servicing debt than we are on national security. And that becomes a real challenge for us at that point, because as China continues to expand its capabilities, we have to continue to innovate and respond to stay ahead of the curve and to be able to overcome whatever threats that may be able to pose to us. That will become challenged down the road if we are unable to do it, because we are now X% of our budget is all being spent towards servicing the debt. In fact, the day will come when the servicing of the debt could eat up the entire federal budget. So basically everything else we're doing is all entirely on borrowed money, which only exacerbates that situation, which is why what we've seen now is so concerning. Look, the pandemic hit, nobody had money budgeted for a pandemic that shut down the economy. That's unfortunate. It happened. Everyone's had to deal with it. But what you see now is an effort to put $4, $5, $6 trillion on top of that already. Not, all in one chunk, not as a gradual thing. It's just not sustainable. There's no taxes you could raise. And at that point, at that level, no amount of economic growth that will ever bring us back to a level of sanity. But I think the most immediate thing that the debt does is if it creates any sort of economic, governmental instability in the country, that's a national security threat. And if we are unable to invest on the military and our military capabilities because of how much money we have to spend servicing the debt and the cuts are coming out of defense, I think you could live in a world where China potentially has military advantages over us, at least in Asia, that actually force us to abandon the region and leave it to them. They basically will be able to become what they want.
Well, we've got time for two more questions. I've got a question from Nathan here. Senator Rubio, when you have encountered conservative or Republican pushback on the kind of economic statecraft and industrial policy you believe is necessary to respond to China, what have you observed that wins them over to your point of view, either with constituents or with people in D.C.?
Well, actually, I think the turning point really has been the pandemic. I think the pandemic revealed vulnerabilities in our supply chain. I think waking up one day and realizing that we depend on China for medical gowns, for Tylenol, for masks, and other personal protective equipment was stunning to a lot of people. So I think that realization is one. And then I think more recently, some of these disruptions that we have seen in terms of vulnerabilities on semiconductors, on some of the higher tech issues on rare earth minerals. I think pointing to those things and the reality that China has an industrial plan, and its industrial plan is tailored towards one specific goal, and that is supplanting America as the world's most powerful country across the spectrum. That realization, pointing that out, I think has begun to transform some people, not all the way there, but part of the way there. Understand that for many, many years, the consensus in American politics and economic debate was that once China got rich and prosperous, they'd become like us. I think there's a growing number of people now in both parties and across the political spectrum that have accepted that that's just not true, and that's not going to be true. So I think pointing to that has really helped. And then I think everyone who's getting elected now, I think is coming from that new school of thought. So part of it is folks that came of age politically or started politically at a different time and place where the consensus was very different and have a long record of those positions. So I think we've made a lot of headway in that regard.
And the last question that we'll take is from Alex, and it has to do with unions. In the last few decades, the American right has had a tenuous relationship with labor unions. The question is, are you optimistic about more union workers embracing a conservative economic vision, and does the right need to reassess its relationship with labor unions?
Well, I think the right, so first of all, our voter base from the right has long been a working class base. And I think that has only accelerated over the last 5 years, primarily because of many of the cultural issues from the far left that have really alienated working class voters who basically live life on the basis of common sense and not lunacy. And so that has attracted them towards the President Trump's agenda. And in many ways, we're already voting with us on that. I think that what you have seen is an increasing recognition on the part of those on the right that part of that the core of our economic policy is not simply economic growth. It is economic growth or economic growth that creates good paying jobs for millions of Americans. So it can't just be growth that's concentrated in one place or in one industry. It has to be the kind of growth that's also creating good jobs so that it's good for our economy, but it's also good for the country at large. So a combination of those two things, I think, will continue, particularly the cultural and that economic angle, will continue to allow working Americans to become part of our voter base. And really, ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what unions are. Their constituency are these workers. And so their workers are increasingly already voting for us. The unions will eventually have to adjust to that reality. It's hard to get elected by union members when you consistently are supporting the people that you're not voting for. The only challenge here, of course, is that these are also bargaining unions, right? And I also separate the private sector unions from the public employee unions. I think the public employee unions is a completely different creature that we're talking about here, teacher unions and the like. I'm talking about truck drivers, I'm talking about Teamsters, I'm talking about people working in factories, I'm talking about plumbers, electricians, and pipe fitters. I think our focus should really be on the worker, who may or may not be members of a union. I think ultimately that is what is going to create the opportunity for us to have a better relationship with labor unions where they exist, because their leadership will have to adjust to that reality. What we don't ever want to encourage, though, is adversarial relationships between employer and employee, which I think in many cases is what's happened in some of these industries. It almost seems like some of these labor bosses are prepared to kill the industry, even if it means their workers are left without a job. So we never want to fall into that trap or that trick. But I honestly think that if we win over the workers and their members, the leadership of those unions will either change or be replaced.
Great. Well, thank you, Senator Rubio. We're about out of time, but just wanted to give you an opportunity. Is there any final points or notes you wanted to hit on when you're thinking about our students and alumni in the room as they think of the challenges we face on political economy as a country? Yeah,
let me tell you, this is a historic time of transition. And it's hard to say because it's happening so fast, but there are these pivot points in history, the Industrial Revolution, the post-World War II era, what that meant for America. This is all of that, except it's faster and bigger and global in scale. So you are coming of age, you are entering, your work careers or your political careers or whatever it is you endeavor to do at a pivot moment that is of change and transformation that's moving faster and more disruptive than mankind has ever known. I think there's tremendous challenges embedded in it, but I also think there's incredible and historic opportunity. And I would just say all of the old terminologies, old rules, old ways of describing both politics and economics, a lot of them have really been made obsolete. And we've had, in these periods of transformation in the past, what you have found is there's a lag time between, what the reality is in the world and the ability of public policy to address it. And we're seeing that now, whether it's data breaches and cyber attacks that are becoming a matter of course every single day, whether it's how do you deal with these social media companies that are now basically becoming the gatekeepers of the public square, whether it's our first near-peer competitor since the end of the Cold War on issue after issue, we're finding that the politics, ideas, policies, and approaches of 10 or 15 years ago are completely obsolete. And so too is the historic left-right spectrum in politics. It's sort of being redefined. And so, you're entering an era like that of massive transformation. There's great and enormous opportunity and also the need for a lot of creativity and innovation. So I encourage you guys to continue to focus on that from the center-right perspective, because I do believe at the end of the day, the core principle of free enterprise is and liberty and common sense. If we stick to those three principles, I think America's got a great future ahead of it.
Great. Thanks, Senator Rubio. Please join me in...
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you.